So if I asked you today to name a graphics card which was hot running and power hungry, chances are you're probably going to point to the red team, perhaps something like the R9 290X or the Fury cards, maybe the HD 6900 series. Well, fanboys rejoice. While Maxwell and Pascal are certainly cool and constrained Nvidia cards, Nvidia themselves are not immune to releasing a fiery beast of a GPU into the public's hands. I'm of course talking about Nvidia's 2010 GPU line, Fermi. Now, to understand why these cards are the way they are, we first need to understand what was happening with the red team at this time. AMD were high flying, and with the recently released HD 5000 series, ushering in DirectX 11 capabilities at an affordable price point and bundling in a power efficiency on top of that, Nvidia, in traditional green team fashion, wanted to eclipse the HD 5870 and create the most powerful consumer card
in the world.
Which I know looking at this card might sound like a little, well, hard to believe considering that even in my initial benchmarks it failed to complete most of them with temperatures hitting 105 degrees. But that is what Nvidia set out to do, so let's get this thing cleaned up and see if we can get something out of this neglected former heavyweight. Going back to 2010, and unfortunately for Nvidia at the time, AMD were not only at the forefront of price to performance, they were experiencing a sort of technical renaissance, and the Fermi architecture, while powerful, it was simply more of a brute force solution when compared to AMD's sophisticated offerings. So what was the result of this brute force? Well, the GPU packet size was 529mm squared. To put that into perspective for you, the dead GTX 670 that we had a look at last time, it only came in at 294mm squared, 55% of the size of the GF100 GPU powering the big Fermi cards. This huge size also threw up another problem, manufacturing. As I've discussed in loads of other videos, the larger a chip is, the lower the yields are going to be, and this was even more true back in 2010. This meant that the GTX 400 series cards never actually seen the full GF100 GPU with its full complement of 512 shaders, even on its Halo model, the GTX 480. On the 480, we had one of its SMs disabled. This meant a reduction of 32 shader units to 480. The GTX 470, like we've got here, had two of these shader modules disabled, giving a total of 448 shader units. The memory system on the 470 was also cut back from the GTX 480, and provides us with 1.2GB of VRAM on a cut down 320-bit bus. This is due to the removal of one of the 6 64-bit memory controllers available on the GTX 480. Still, all this talk of cutbacks doesn't actually mean that the GTX 470 was a bad card. Regardless how terrible this particular one looks, it did go toe to toe with AMD's flagship at the time, the 5870, and its smaller sibling, the 5850, and it generally fell somewhere in between the two of them, with the GTX 480 surpassing the HD 5870. Upon stripping back this card, it is at least a fairly nice design for a reference card. We've got thermal pads used throughout, and the GPU heatsink and its fan is attached to a full-length metal spine plate, which helps rigidity, and also helps to remove some of the heat from the memory and VRM thanks to that aforementioned thermal pads. So with the PCB cleaned up using a little bit of elbow grease, Q-tips and the ever-present elixir that is isopropyl alcohol. Okay, so it's my wife's nail varnish remover, but still it's 95% isopropyl. The card itself is starting to look pretty good. And all the areas of burnt fluff surrounding the VRAM look to have done no damage other than stinking when I booted up the card. Perhaps it's maybe a narrow version of disaster here, but we've cleaned it up and everything seems to be okay. But how about the rest of the card? Well, the mounting plate and the tactile shroud? Well, there's probably only one real solution for this. It's strip off the heatsink and the fan, and then fill the sink with boiling water, strong clean liquid and a little bit of white vinegar for good measure, and then just dump them in. Save the hassle and let the chemicals do the work for this. In the meantime, while we let the chemicals do their thing, The usual methods to remove the dust and grime buildup from the heatsink and fan can be applied here to remove the bulk of 7 years or so worth of grime that's built up. The end result? Well, everything is clean, but perhaps the shroud is a little bit too clean, with the combo of sticker residue and chemical cleaner causing some of the plastic to cloud up. Mind you, it's nothing that a lick of paint in the future is not going to cure. But we'll save that for another day. Reassembling the card is as simple as reversing the steps taken to take it apart, and with the spine plates screwed back together, it was time to move back to the PCB. If your card has thermal pads like this one, whenever you decide to refurbish it, you should always replace the pads too. But if, like me, you want to keep costs down, then the cheap and cheerful pads you can find on eBay is going to be fine, and it's going to do a lot more good than the 7-year-old OEM pads that are currently on the card. Applying the pads to the VRM and the power delivery components is as easy as it sounds, and don't be too worried if the pads are not entirely covering the chips. Just like thermal paste, these are going to spread out when we tighten everything up. Speaking of thermal paste, the P or line method might work on a Fermi GPU, but it is a huge package to cover, so you might want to spread it out yourself. I'm using a sterilised glove here to spread it out and reduce the possibility of contaminants, but really it's up to you how you do it. In the end though, we've been left with a factory fresh Fermi 470, but how does it run? Are we still going to crash and burn hitting over 100 degrees? Well, jumping into Crysis 3 and at 1080p on the medium preset with FXAA enabled, the GTX 470 manages to stay above 30 FPS on average minimums and hit close to 50 on average, but the occasional stutter here makes it a less than perfect experience. Dropping the resolution down to 900p however, at the same settings gives a much better experience, with the averages tickling 60 FPS and the stuttering being much less prevalent. Another CryEngine game now, and Prey returns a nicer experience than Crysis 3. And while the experience at 1080p on the medium preset is good, simply dropping the resolution down to 900p and staying much closer to 60 FPS on the average minimums is quite frankly great and unexpected for a card of this age. This makes it possible to lock the game at 60 FPS and keep the GPU under 100% load for a fair part of your playtime, and this also helps lower the temperature in what is already a very toasty processor. Rise of the Tomb Raider is a game which really taxes GPUs, and here's absolutely no exception. 1080p even on the low preset is a no-go, but running the game at 900p on both the medium and low presets does return some interesting results. The medium preset actually activates a lot of the really nice features, but frequent dips below 30 FPS really mars the experience. It's perfectly fine at 900p low, but you do lose some of that nicer sheen that makes the game look great. A decent compromise here, especially for me playing on a big TV, is to drop the resolution down to 720p, use the medium settings and then add on some anti-aliasing. This actually looks better than 900p on the low settings and returns very similar frame rates. Finally, we've got Doom. Now this is a game which would run in a potato if that potato was AMD branded, but Fermi unfortunately is not. On the medium presets it's pretty much a no-go, the frame rates dipping so low and being so stuttery that it is totally unplayable. Even at 900p and dropping to the low preset doesn't quite get us to where we want to be. On Doom it's a game that really loves to be at 60 FPS. But a reduction to 720p again on the low preset sees the average minimums jump up to 60 FPS, meaning that we can quite happily blast through the game with the fluidity and ease that Doom demands. So what about the temps? Well, the new thermal paste and pads and the clean fan and heatsink have really helped this card. Instead of spiking to 105 degrees and shutting off, the card now settles around about 81 degrees at full load. I mean, it's still a really hot card, but Fermi wouldn't be any other way than that. But the big question, is it worth it in 2017? Well, probably no. I mean, there's a lot of other cards out there, even from the Fermi refresh, that's got to play games better and run cooler, and for the £21 I paid, I'm pretty sure you could get something a little bit newer and better suited to modern gaming. Still, that's one less Fermi on its way to the smelter, another rescued card, and one that I'm sure we'll find some uses for in the future. As always folks, thanks for watching this perhaps longer than usual video. Since becoming a dad last week, I've found that time is now at a premium. But but there's still a good few projects in the pipeline, so be sure to subscribe and see those, and tell me what you think of the Fermi cards, if you've had one or if you would consider buying one now. So I'll see you all down below, and in the next video.